Number 5. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A good tagline can really sell your movie, you know? In space, no one can hear you scream. You'll believe a man can fly. Absolute classics. In my opinion, there's few that go harder than the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre's bold proclamation and threat: who will survive and what will be left of them. The original Texas Chainsaw is a legend of horror, practically kickstarting slasher movies altogether. While there's a whole other discussion to be had about what could be considered the first true slasher movie, there's no denying that Chainsaw wrote the rulebook. Hulking monsters in a mask, a screaming final girl, Texas Chainsaw was writing the rules years before Michael Myers was chasing Jamie Lee. Texas Chainsaw is the classic slasher premise. A group of hapless young fools all fall victim to the kind of horrors that only exist in our worst nightmares. The Sawyer clan are a family of deranged hillbillies living in rural Texas who believe in using every part of the meat they hunt for their chili. They're not really interested in beef though. It's almost got a bit of a misleading name. You hear Texas Chainsaw Massacre and you imagine a sea of corn syrup, blood, and special effects that'll leave you needing a barf bag. And hey, don't worry. The stream of sequels and remakes that followed definitely do get there. The 2006 one is maybe one of the grossest movies I've ever seen. But the original is a much better made movie than any of that. It's honestly not nearly as gory as the title would have you believe, and would probably be considered tame by modern standards. I'd go so far as to say it's a masterpiece. Few movies capture the feeling of true insanity the way this one does. The screaming, the hooting, the hollering, being hunted by the Sawyers is the kind of fear that feels like it belongs in an evidence locker, not in a theater. It says something that in a study using Texas Chainsaw as a litmus test for audience perceptions of horror movies, the survey came back saying that the scariest thing in the entire movie was not the monsters or the chainsaws, but just the screams of the victims. Hey, enjoying what we do? We'd love if you toss and subscribe our way for more scary content every single day. Number 4. Sinister. Now, I normally don't like to bring science into a discussion about horror movies or about ghosts, but a recent 2020 study involving attaching heart monitors to viewers and making them watch horror movies while researchers tracked their heart rates apparently revealed Sinister to be the scariest movie of all time. Medically speaking, proof is in the pudding, or the heart rate. To be completely honest, I definitely see where they're coming from. I didn't need any sort of medical equipment to tell you I found Sinister downright terrifying. Sinister at first seems like it's going to be a pretty run-of-the-mill, corny ghost house movie, but after about 15 minutes my worries were put to bed and instead replaced by nightmares. A struggling true crime writer, played by a personal favorite, Mr. Ethan Hawke, moves into a house knowingly that was host to a series of grisly, horrifying rituals to some dark god. Hey, in this economy, you gotta take whatever deals you can. He moves in hoping that getting close to the scene of the crime will inspire his writings, and it sort of does, in a way, because he finds a series of films in the attic all showcasing the brutal things that have happened in his new home. And it does not take long before our would-be writer is obsessing over his home movie collection, letting it affect his work, his family, and his brain. Another great one where you're never sure how supernatural things are until you're extremely sure. Ethan Hawke rides the line well between kind of being dumb enough that you sort of think he deserves what's coming to him, but also sympathetic enough that you don't want to see him get grabbed anytime soon. A fantastic score sets the tone, leaving you always just a little anxious and your heart never quite slowing down enough to breathe. The scenes of the home movies in question are actually some of the scariest things I think I've ever seen in a Hollywood flick, and definitely deserve special mention, as they're probably the highlight of the film. Disturbingly real enough to seem like they might actually have happened, and restrained enough as well that it never dwells on the violence too much, letting your imagination fill in all the horrible, horrible blanks. Number 3. Saw. Now, Saw is hardly underrated or some hidden gem. They made 9 of them. I think everyone knows about Jigsaw and his sick little games by now, but that doesn't stop the original 2004 film from being one of my go-to Halloween movies every year. Equal parts detective thriller and equal parts stomach-churningly terrifying, there's a simple elegance to the first Saw. Before the storyline became so convoluted you needed a historian to help you navigate the timeline and secret double crosses, backstabs, betrayals, and secret jigsaws, there was just 2 men, a freaky little puppet, one rancid bathroom, and a saw. The movies get ridiculous very, very fast, with Jigsaw's level of control varying from superhuman levels of planning to straight up bad man, bad guy in some of the sequels. And the first is like that too, but there's something so terrifyingly real about the first one, you know? It feels like the worst intrusive thought you could ever have. Imagine someone had been stalking you, making a list of your wrongdoings, and wanted to test if you truly appreciated your life, if you'd be willing to fight for it. As a kid, even though I knew he was a fictional character played by a guy who's actually pretty nice in real life, I was terrified that one day I would wake up chained to a radiator, hear that hiss and crackle of the TV static, and see that evil little puppet grinning up at me. The first movie cuts all the fat, pun intended, and gets in good as you watch Jigsaw's two victims descend to madness at a breakneck pace when they realizes the consequences are more dire than they could have ever assumed, and there isn't a way for either of these men to leave in one piece. It's gross, it's lowbrow, it is absolutely edge of your seat horrifying. I think the first one has one of the most off-putting atmospheres I've ever seen in a horror movie. Every inch of that set just looks like it was abhorrently rancid. It looks like it's not even safe to be breathing in there. It just feels jagged and sticky, you know? Like you gotta take a shower after watching. Number 2, Hereditary. Now, it would not be a scariest horror movie list without Hereditary. Hereditary, to date, is the only movie I thought, hey, I might have to walk out of this because I genuinely don't think I can take what's happening. Now, the more likely scenario is that I'm a massive wimp, but the other very likely possibility is that this movie is just gut-wrenchingly terrifying. Hereditary tells us the story of a doomed family seeking to uncover and hopefully break the generational curse placed on them as a gift from their passing matriarch, who seems to have been up to some shadier business than anyone could have known. After a heinously tragic accident, the family finds themselves descending into a web of madness, distrust, and fear. Hereditary is probably one of the scariest movies I've ever seen, and there's barely so much as a jump scare. There's very little in the ways of ghouls, goblins, or ghosts in this one, just itchy fear. That fear of being unable to protect your family, watching it all fall apart, and the age-old fear of wondering if perhaps you've got some sort of ancient, unavoidable satanic curse placed on you and your family. You know, regular stuff. The movie builds agonizingly slowly, leaving you waiting and wondering the entire time if there really is anything supernatural happening or if you're just driving yourself mad wondering while you watch. If you like a slower burn kind of horror movie, then Hereditary is perfect for you. It's full of the kind of nightmarish imagery that isn't leaving you anytime soon, and that's where it scares best, showing you something for just a second or two that you would never want to see in your life, ever, not dwelling on it too long, but just enough to stick in your head like a bad dream, and then appear in your bad dreams every night thereafter. Number 1, Halloween. Okay guys, I'm gonna come clean, I'm gonna be honest. This whole channel is all just a big ruse for me to talk about the Halloween movies. All the other videos are nothing more than a facade for my real goal, to talk about Michael Myers and his sometime sister Laurie Strode. The Megalodon, ghosts, aliens, all my lesser muses. Compared to some other entries on this list, or even its many sequels, the original Halloween is downright tame in terms of blood and gore. In fact, there's actually barely any blood and no gore. A stark contrast to Rob Zombie and David Gordon Green's approach to the boogeyman. The original really focuses on the cat and mouse game between the Shape and his obsession, Laurie Strode. Most horror movie protagonists, usually the protagonists, have condemned themselves to some karmic fate. Like I mentioned, the guy from Sinister chose to watch all those scary tapes. The counselors who venture to Camp Crystal Lake every year, despite the warnings, it makes us, the audience, not really feel bad for what's about to happen to them because we know they sealed their doom. But Laurie Strode is a completely innocent bystander to all of it, who just has the unfortunate stroke of bad luck of just happening to be the wrong person standing in the wrong place when Michael sets his eyes on her, spurring a 4-decade-long obsession. That terrifying implication that it could happen to anyone, that the boogeyman could be behind you at any time, making you his next victim solely because you were in the way. Some horror movies from the 70s and 80s start to show their age, but masterful film work like Halloween doesn't. The way the camera lingers on Michael with that haunting synth soundtrack still riles me up to this day. That tension in the air when Michael starts to go after Laurie's friends, first disguising himself in that ghost sheet. Hey. Other movies always walk the line with what Michael is, with some of them offering detailed backstories. Sometimes he's born out of a dark cult, sometimes he had a troubled childhood and no one but Rob Zombie understood him. But in the original, we get the most concise, simple, and effective explanation. He's evil. He's just pure evil behind those black eyes, and that is the scariest answer imaginable. Midsommar. So, first up on our list of the scariest movies is gonna be Midsommar, a movie that may hold the record for the fastest time I have ever seen something become a classic. I think Midsommar became a horror movie classic roughly 30 seconds or so after we left the theater. And there are some out there who knock on Midsommar for not being enough of a horror movie, but I would like to say boo on you. I think that's mostly bogus, just because it takes place during the day, and because like Hereditary before it, Midsommar is that nice kind of elevated horror that doesn't just get your hair standing on end and your spine all chilled, but also manages to get under your skin and start to pick away at stuff you didn't even know you were insecure and scared about. Just a bit after Ari Aster had traumatized all of us out of ever looking at a stop sign the same way in Hereditary, we got Midsommar, which will ensure I will never look at a bear the same way ever again. While Hereditary picked apart at the foundations of a crumbling family, Midsommar instead takes us into watching a friend group and a young couple getting torn apart, both metaphorically, which is scary in a very esoteric way, and literally, which is scary in a wow, that's disgusting kind of way. After a horrific, sad tragedy claims the lives of most of young Danny's family, she and her boyfriend find themselves growing distant from one another. Things look like they're gonna change when her boyfriend Christian invites her to a Swedish commune with his classmates. What looks at first like an idyllic vacation quickly unravels when it seems that commune is a Swedish word meaning scary pagan human sacrifice call, and Danny finds herself at odds with a new family that seems to welcome her grief with open arms. Midsommar contrasts gorgeous visuals of the Swedish landscape with some of the most stomach-churning body horror I've seen in a Hollywood production recently. Do you know what a blood eagle is, my friends? If you don't, do yourself a favor and don't Google that, okay? And if you do, yeah, well, you just know how horrible that was in this movie, eh? I figured we've all seen Midsommar. It's non-stop scares, but somehow, if you haven't, let me be the 1000th person to tell you should watch this movie. If you like spooky cult movies, this is probably one of the best out there. Just, don't be surprised if you can't bear some of the stuff that happens in this movie. That's a little pun about a bear. Now, my friends, if you're looking for more videos about horror movies you should watch, maybe some scary urban legends, stuff about SCPs, aliens, and just about anything freaky, well, subscribe to Top 5 Scary, because we got all of that and then some. Stay scared, stay subscribed. Number 4, Incantation. Coming up next on the list is gonna be Incantation. It's the most recent one on this list. It just came out, and I guarantee it's not like anything else you've seen, unless you're a huge fan of Taiwanese found footage cinema, in which case, yeah, it'll probably be pretty similar to that, because that's what it is. Right off the bat, Incantation invites the viewer to join in on it, with one of the characters breaking the fourth wall and directly asking the audience to say a prayer for her daughter, which I think is such a good hook to immediately get you into a movie. A little bit of audience interaction, and then forming the movie as a found footage horror movie made it seem that much more real, like you kind of forget that you're watching a production. It immerses you into the characters as much as a movie possibly could. A young woman named Lee Ronan reveals to us that years earlier, she broke a religious taboo by spying on a secret ritual, and as such cursed herself and her bloodline. And when her daughter is born, she finds herself being haunted by a malevolent spirit. This movie is like a buffet plate of horror genres. If you like haunted house stuff, demon possession stuff, exorcisms, well, this movie brings all of that to the table and makes all of it gripping and horrifying. And if you like really inventive, metatextual, postmodern horror stuff, well, the framing device and the found footage elements really pump it all up, and I wouldn't dream of giving away the movie's twists, but it has some that you genuinely cannot possibly see coming that turn the whole experience on its head. And admittedly, maybe this is more me telling on myself for having a very Hollywood-esque kind of centralized North American horror movie palette, but it's very refreshing to see a story centered around people I don't see often in movies and a culture I don't see often in movies, somewhere I don't see often, making an already inventive script just feel that much more fresh, you know? Don't be afraid of the subtitles, and don't deprive yourself out of Incantation if you're looking for a great new cursed movie to watch. Just, if you want my advice, definitely say your prayers before and after watching, you know, just to be absolutely safe. Number 3, Killing of a Sacred Deer. Coming up next is going to be Killing of a Sacred Deer from Yorgos Lanthimos, who has one of my favorite names in cinema. I needed at least one really psychological horror movie on this list that I figured most of you probably haven't seen. Like all of Lanthimos' filmography, Sacred Deer is relentlessly weird. If you want to watch a movie that's going to leave you shaking, sweating, and asking yourself in your dark living room, what the hell did I just watch? Then you're gonna love Sacred Deer, okay? A heart surgeon named Steven, played by Colin Farrell. He's got a perfect life, 2 children, a successful career, and a very, very strange relationship with a mysterious young boy named Martin, played excellently by Barry Keoghan. We learn that years earlier, Steven had operated on Martin's father, but failed to save his life, and since then has kind of taken Martin in and kept an extremely odd paternal relationship with the exceedingly strange boy, who seems determined to force himself into Steven's family by any means necessary. As Martin begins to uncomfortably ingratiate himself with Steven's children, their health starts to worsen in mysterious, paranormal ways that hospitals can't explain, and it seems like Martin knows a lot more than he's letting on. This movie feels like an actual honest-to-God nightmare that somebody filmed. It's kind of hard to describe. It doesn't really have jump scares. It's got next to no gore. There's like blood, I guess, but most of the horror comes from this unending dread, this creeping, unsettling feeling in the air that everything you're seeing is wrong. Every single line of dialogue in this movie does not sound like it was written or performed by a human being. I know that sounds like a bad movie, but everyone is performing so well that the atmosphere is like a mile thick. Everyone just talks in a way that's not in a way you expect or you're used to. It seems like everyone's from a different planet ever so slightly. It's so surreal, it feels like an extended dream. There's a scene where Barry Keoghan's character is describing how he and his dad used to eat spaghetti the same way, by swirling noodles around a fork, and it's a very innocuous conversation, but the whole thing around it is so chilling, it genuinely had me sweating. If there's anyone who thinks Barry Keoghan isn't gonna make a good Joker, please watch this movie and then come right back to me. This guy is so good at being a lunatic. This one is not gonna be for everybody, I'll be straight up. If you like your horror a little bit artsy, like if Midsommar and Hereditary totally spoke to you, Killing of a Sacred Deer probably will as well. But, you know, if you're looking for something with like a guy in a mask who's breaking through windows and pulling on Jamie Lee Curtis's ponytail, this might not be up your alley. If you're looking for something splattery and splashy, well, it might just leave you extremely confused. Number 2, The Ritual. Coming up next on the list is going to be The Ritual from director David Bruckner, part of the horror collective that contributed to the cult classic found footage movie VHS, as well as directing 2020's The Night House. The Ritual is one you can find on Netflix, and if you don't load it up after this video immediately, we're probably gonna have an issue. A group of college friends meet together after a shocking tragedy claims the life of one of their friends in a random robbery. Now, before the incident, they all had made plans to hike in the woods of Sweden, and let me just pause here for a minute. Is it a bit odd that 2 of the scariest horror movies made in the last 10 years involve a group of friends going out on a vacation to Sweden? If I'm learning anything from this list in contemporary filmmaking, it's that it's not nearly as welcoming as I thought. But I digress. The friends go to Sweden in their late friend's honor and discover that it is really not the best of ideas when things turn horribly wrong very quickly. Discovering an elk gutted out in the woods, they suspect there is a lot more out in those woods than just the wildlife. The Ritual is kind of like if the Blair Witch Project and the Wicker Man loved each other very dearly and had a beautiful baby and they let it play with Midsommar on the weekends. You get to watch a friend group at odds with themselves lost in the woods, deal with mysteries of a secret Nordic cult, and it's got lots of good creepy supernatural cult stuff, and I don't want to spoil it too much, but I'll say it's got one of the coolest monsters put to film in recent memory I can think of. I would love a statue of that thing. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot is going to be The Mist. Directed by Frank Darabont, who is probably the king of adapting Stephen King's works into films, having directed The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist. Interestingly though, unlike The Green Mile and The Shawshank Redemption, which are both very accurate depictions of the source material, The Mist deviates a little bit. It's got an alternate ending which is way darker than the original story, but here's the catch. Stephen King actually says he prefers it, which has to be the highest compliment possible. If the guy who wrote the original terrifying story can watch the movie and say, you did a better job. He certainly didn't say that about Stanley Kubrick. If you don't know the plot of The Mist, like all Stephen King movies, it takes place in a small town in Maine when a massive thunderstorm has descended upon the community. It focuses on a group of ordinary people caught in a grocery store locked in as a mysterious mist starts to encircle the town, and strange creatures from beyond this world start to complicate things. This thing is very tight, focusing on what happens to normal people when put up against the most overwhelming odds imaginable, trapped with eldritch horrors threatening them just outside their little sanctuary of suburbia, and trying to protect your family from all the danger. It is tense as all get out. If you like monsters and creative monsters too, oh man is The Mist a treat. They hide them well, you know, in the mist. You never get too good a look at any of them, but that wouldn't be much fun. The way they do it here, letting you catch glimpses here and there, and letting your mind fill in all the horrible details and all the tentacle abominations, oh baby, that's horror at its finest. Reminds me a bit of Cloverfield in that regard. You know, The Mist might not be the scariest movie ever made, but it is an absolutely great one that is often forgot about sometimes when we discuss great horror movies. It's out there on Netflix, so you got no reason not to. In fact, I tried pretty hard to curate this list of mostly stuff that was streaming on Netflix so you could watch them after I was done talking about it. Don't say the casual Crypt Keeper doesn't do anything nice for you now. 5. The Conjuring. Now, if you're a fan of this channel, no doubt you know all about Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famed demonologists with a storied career in investigating the paranormal and unknown. You probably knew as well that The Conjuring was based on real events, but how much do you know about the real story that inspired the mega hit? Well, just like the film, in 1971, the Perron family moved into a 14-room farmhouse in Rhode Island with their 5 daughters. Almost as soon as they could start unpacking their things, however, they began to notice bizarre happenings around the home. It all started pretty small, just weird little things. objects moving, a broom being found in a room different from where it was left. The girls would say that they'd see spirits floating around the halls, but you know how kids are. The mother, Carolyn, researched the house's history to see if there was anything that suggested it was a ground for spiritual activity. She discovered that the house had been home to one family for 8 generations. Not that scary. She also discovered that many members of this family all passed away under mysterious circumstances. Pretty scary. Now, just like the film, they learned at one point the house was owned by a woman named Bethesda, who was thought to be a Satanist and a witch. One of the parents' daughters thought that Bethesda's spirit threatened her mother's presence. And just like in the films, the Warrens found their way to the parents and performed a seance to try and speak to Bethesda and claimed they saw Carolyn Perrin speaking in tongues during the seance. Now, where the movie differs slightly is that in the film, Ed Warren performs an exorcism and heroically saves the family and cleanses the house. But in the real story, the Warrens were sent away because the parents were worried about Carolyn's mental health. They also did not perform an exorcism, as Lorraine Warren said it wouldn't have been appropriate for them as they weren't members of the ministry. The parents stayed in the house until 1980, when eventually the hauntings started to go silent. This might be one of the few times a horror movie based on a true story had a happier ending than the real story. Love horror movies? Me too. Stick around at Top 5 Scary for more stuff every day. Let's creep on creeping on. Number 4. The Amityville Horror. Another haunted house story, and wouldn't you know it, another one attached to Ed and Lorraine Warren. If there was a haunted house in the Midwestern United States in the 1970s and they made a movie about it, well, by gum, those two names will come up a lot. They were very busy. The Amityville Horror has been made into a movie a few times, first in 1979 and again in 2005, if you can remember that terrible period when Hollywood was dredging up every single horror franchise and rebooting them terribly. Both movies are based on a real-life famous haunting, however, and while details vary between the films pretty wildly, let's see how they stack up against the original case. In 1973, a man named Ronald DeFeo slayed his family in a brutal crime, claiming that he had heard voices that had commanded him to do it, and there was some entity in the house. 13 months later, the Lutz family bought the house. The realtors had warned them about the house's grisly past, but it didn't bother them. You know how the housing market is. A friend of the family told them that it would be wise to have the house blessed, since there could still be evil inside the walls. After the family moved in, they described all sorts of paranormal wrongdoings going on. Green viscous slime coming up the staircases, voices speaking out to them, telling them to get out, flies all over the house, and the family even seeing wild things like specters. Now that's all pretty bad, but the film adaptations really take it up to the extreme. In the films, the Lutz family faces spirits directly, seeing ghosts, the father even gets possessed and attacks the family dog. Now, nothing this extreme happened in the actual haunting case, but there was a photo that was released that appears to show a ghostly boy walking across a staircase. But there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not it's legitimate, or whether or not anything involving the haunting was legitimate at all, as there are many who feel that it was faked by the Warrens and hyped up a little bit to try and make it a much more interesting story so they could sell books or movies. Well, real or not, it definitely worked, as the book was a smash hit and there have been dozens of movies since, meaning we're not leaving Amityville anytime soon. Number 3. The Exorcism. Now, The Exorcism is an iconic horror movie and legendary story adapted from a novel. Not many people know that the novel and the film were based on a real-life exorcism of a boy named Roland Doe, or so we think, as his real name has never been cleared up. Living in Maryland, Roland lived a quiet, sheltered life, relying on his aunt for company, a noted occultist, and fascinated with the spirit world. She gifted him a Ouija board at a young age. After his aunt passed, it wasn't long before the family home started to experience a series of strange paranormal events. Like it always does, it started a bit small, just objects moving around the house or water leaking from all the pipes in the house, but then eventually it started to ramp up. It seemed like Roland had become possessed. He started to fall mysteriously ill, and red scratches appeared all over the boy's body. The family was put in contact with the clergy, who suggested they needed an exorcist to help them. Now, unfortunately, although in the film, Reagan only needed one exorcism, albeit a brutally rough one, Roland wouldn't be nearly that lucky. Roland was exorcised round the clock for weeks and weeks. Now, he never turned green and vomited up pea soup, nor did he ever twist his head all the way around, but they did report that he would growl gutturally in a voice that wasn't his. He would speak Latin, and even threatened the priests by saying that Satan had taken control of his soul. On one occasion, during an extreme exorcism, he broke free of his restraints when he was tied to a mattress and managed to slash at one of the priests using the buckle, similar to Reagan attacking her exorcisers multiple times in the film. After weeks of battling, eventually like a miracle, Roland woke and said he saw a vision of Saint Michael and Satan battling for his soul, and after that, he was freed. None of the priests were slain like in the film, and luckily after this harrowing experience, Roland was able to live a quiet, normal life and tried his best to live under the radar, not wanting any more attention than he'd already had. After reading about it in a newspaper, author William Blatty was fascinated by the case and inspired to write about an exorcism of his own, which would then become The Exorcism, and then the movie was made, and well, the rest is pretty much history. Number 2. Annabelle. Another famous story from the Warrens' legacy. We knew we'd be seeing them again. Based around probably the most famous and recognizable haunted item in the Warrens' Museum of the Occult, Annabelle. The real Annabelle is a cursed Raggedy Ann doll that was one of the first cases the Warrens ever investigated. Now the real Annabelle already looks pretty unsettling and isn't the kind of thing I would ever give to a child, but her Hollywood glow-up made her even more terrifying. The story of the film and the legend of the real Annabelle differ pretty greatly though. In the film, Annabelle is given off as a gift from a husband to his pregnant wife, whereas in reality, the Raggedy Ann doll was given to a nursing student, Donna, by her mother as a small gift. The film does feature Donna and her roommate Angie speaking to the Warrens at the beginning, describing their experiences with the doll. That's kind of where the two stories stop being the same and start differing greatly. The original story, Donna claims that the doll would move around their home, appearing in random places, occasionally having red stains on her no one could explain. She would complain that her and her roommate would wake up covered in scratches, again, no one could explain. They said they would find notes scrawled in red writing across the home, reading cryptic things like "Help us" or "Help Lou," the name of Donna's roommate's fiance. The most extreme thing any of them ever reported was that Donna's fiance claims one night while staying over, he felt something crawling on his leg, and when he looked to see what it was, he saw Annabelle on his leg and claims the doll leapt up at him. He woke up the next morning completely unsure if what he had experienced was real or not. Now from there, they contacted a medium to arrange a seance to see if they were dealing with something truly evil. From here, the Warrens were put in contact to help them and take Annabelle off their friends. While the real story is no doubt spine-chilling, the movie got a lot more dramatic, involving satanic cults, deaths, house fires, and a whole lot more. But still, I probably wouldn't want to spend any time near the real Annabelle, just in case. Number 1. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven was a master of horror. I don't think it is completely fair to call him a visionary and an icon of the craft, giving us not just one, but two legendary classic horror movie franchises, A Nightmare on Elm Street and the satirical horror movie series Scream. Freddy Krueger is larger than life as a horror icon. He's incredibly popular, appearing in several of his own movies, even coming into some of Jason's movies, starring in a couple video games as a playable character in Mortal Kombat and Dead by Daylight. A horribly burned dream-invading ghoul, manifesting people's worst fear and attacking them in a place no one can help them and no one can believe them. He's terrifying, but by gosh do we love him. It's no wonder Freddy's had such scary staying power. But I bet you didn't know Wes Craven was inspired by a real-life horror story for Freddy. Don't worry, there's no real-life groundskeepers that were cast into a furnace, at least I think. Wes Craven was reading the LA Times one morning and he read an article that pierced him and stuck with him. It was about a refugee family that fled to the United States for the fear of their lives. The son of the family was plagued by nightmares and said that he was too afraid to sleep. When he finally found himself falling asleep in the middle of the night, he was screaming and passed away during a nightmare. This spoke to Wes Craven deeply, who sympathized that he was too afraid to sleep and no one would listen to his worries, and saddened at the idea of something that would attack someone while they were vulnerable and away from the protection of supervisors and guardians. From that tragic story, Freddy Krueger was born as a manifestation of this horrible concept that affected Wes Craven so deeply, trying to conjure up the most evil thing he could think of. Since then, Freddy's become a pop culture icon and is not without his legions of fans, but few know the true story behind the iconic slasher. Number 5. The Lighthouse. From visionary director Robert Eggers comes The Lighthouse, a harrowing fable that teaches us the importance of respecting personal boundaries and respecting seabirds. Eggers is one of my favorite modern horror directors, whose work sits a cut above the most usual horror fare with The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman, which isn't quite horror unless you're terrified of Norway. The Lighthouse is unlike any other scary movies you've seen. Actually, it's probably unlike most movies you've seen. It's kind of hard to define The Lighthouse under one genre. It's unsettling and definitely makes me feel all heebly-jeebly watching it, but it isn't horror in the traditional sense. There's no monsters or slashers, just two men, a lighthouse, a whole lot of seagulls, and enough cabin fever-induced madness to shake a lobster at. A rookie lighthouse keeper, played by Robert Pattinson, is assigned to keep a lighthouse on a small isolated island off the coast of New England, under the supervision of the island's crusty old master, Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson are some of the best working actors out there right now, and the two of these titans absolutely show up for this, carrying this two-headed character piece on their backs and speaking in some of the most hilariously memorable accents ever put to film. Seriously, Willem Dafoe's old nautical piratical accent in this thing needs to be taught in acting schools. I would do an impression, but I won't do it justice. The film is shot beautifully, the whole thing seeming like a mix between a bad dream and an avant-garde theater production, leaving you asking the entire time if anything you're seeing can be trusted, if any of it's even happening, or if the whole thing is all just one twisted nightmare between two very lonely, isolated men. Now, I can't say for sure if they went nuts because they weren't subscribed to Top 5 Scary, but I'm willing to bet that a little bit of entertainment from the best scary videos channel on the web might have helped some of that madness. So subscribe, maybe. Number 4, Annihilation. I've talked a bit about Annihilation before on this channel, and I will continue to do so until Annihilation gets the respect it deserves. That's my mission. I've never forgiven the movie-going populace for not seeing this one in theaters. Annihilation came to us from director and writer Alex Garland, who also gave us Ex Machina, a fantastic movie about having a crush on a robot. Annihilation is a cosmic horror story detailing the effects of after an asteroid crashes to Earth and a mysterious alien presence known as the Shimmer begins to manifest across a quarantine zone in a forest outside an army base. Everything the Shimmer touches starts to blend together, biological life merging, double helixes swirling in a big cosmic gumbo. The film is hauntingly beautiful as it is terrifying. Our protagonist Lena, played by Natalie Portman, is a US Army veteran who lost her husband in an unrelated combat mission. One day he shows up on her doorstep, convulsing violently, leading Lena towards the Shimmer. Learning her husband was involved, she ventures forth with a group of fellow researchers and soldiers to uncover what lies at the heart of the Shimmer, what's causing it, and if it can be stopped. The film is a visual treat with its lush vistas and uniquely terrifying monster designs. I've talked about Annihilation Bear before, and I will take any opportunity to talk about Annihilation Bear. I love Annihilation Bear. Slap a photo of him back there for me. Annihilation is the perfect kind of horror movie, simultaneously exploring complex themes of depression, grief, humanity's inherent nature and propensity towards self-destructive behavior, but it also asks even bigger questions like, wouldn't it be really yucky if a bear had a human skull inside its head that screamed like a dying human while it was roaring? Get you a horror movie that can do both, okay? Number 3, Jacob's Ladder. While the first 2 entries on our list were pretty recent and well received, I want to throw it back a couple decades for our next entry and highlight a cult classic that could always use a little bit more love. Jacob's Ladder details the story of Jacob Singer, a Vietnam veteran who 4 years later, after returning home from the war, struggles to readjust to his normal life. Not helping matters much, no doubt, is the fact that Jacob keeps seeing horrifying monstrosities surrounding him every day. It seems as if since he's come home, nothing has ever been the same. The film shows us life through Jacob's tormented eyes. As he tries to navigate through healing and overcoming his personal demons, he is constantly haunted by real-life demons that seem to have a very vested interest in him. Matters only serve to get a lot more confusing when Jacob learns that other members of his platoon, back from his army days, have all been suffering similar things, reporting seeing the same monsters and being haunted. Desperate to find the truth, Jacob seeks out the cause of what's happening to him and his old friends, and ends up descending down a path of madness, learning things no man ever should. Worth noting is just how influential Jacob's Ladder is, serving as one of the direct inspirations for the legendary Silent Hill series of games, with Silent Hill 2 in particular taking major inspiration from the film's plotline, monsters, twists, right down to the protagonists even wearing the exact same outfit as a little homage. Jacob's Ladder is a little older than some of the other entries on this list. It is absolutely worth a watch and still worth your time. A great performance out of Tim Robbins and one of the most wild twist-ending horror movies ever had. A bunch have tried to copy this. I'm sure you've seen a million hack writers copy it, but no one did it as cool as when Jacob's Ladder did it, so there. And actually thinking about it, I shouldn't even mention a twist, so there was no twist. Everything in Jacob's Ladder happens very literally. Go into it knowing that, okay? Number 2, Sinister. Moving. It's always stressful, isn't it? It's a huge pain. Well, Sinister is a 2012 horror film about an everyday family moving houses and all the trials and tribulations that come with that, like having to update your postal code on your information, unpacking your stuff and figuring out where all your art books are gonna go, and finding out that you moved into a house where a series of grisly rituals happened, sacrificing the previous family who lived here, and it's all been filmed filmed and kept in a box upstairs in the attic. You know, just regular stuff the kids go through all the time. A struggling true crime novelist is trying to chase his glory days and intentionally moves into a house he knows where ghastly deaths took place in order to get close to the story so he can better research it and write a bestseller. He discovers a box in the attic full of film of all of the crimes and becomes obsessed with uncovering and exposing what happened, mostly so he can make a quick buck and get himself back on top again and make the late night circuit. As his obsession grows, it starts to affect his family and children in concerning ways, as everyone in the family starts acting stranger, having visions, hallucinations, and psychotic episodes, leaving you wondering if there is something much deeper going on in this house beyond a floundering author chasing a bestseller. Now, if you haven't seen this one, it's definitely worth going into this one as blind as you possibly can, because the twists and turns totally make this one. I spent the entire runtime of this propped up on the edge of the couch, my heart pounding, hoping that everything would turn out to be totally okay, even though I knew better. It's a horror movie, things never go great. The movie's got a stellar sense of dread that refuses to let go once it starts, and only lets you breathe out once the credits roll, and even then, not for very long. Fantastic performances across the board, but a special shout out goes to Ethan Hawke, who makes this thing. Number 1, Hereditary. Now, there are a ton of movies that could easily have taken the number 1 spot here, and I thought pretty hard about making The Shining number 1, since, you know, it's kind of a classic, but I figured a lot of people have talked about The Shining, and then I remembered the experience of seeing Hereditary in a movie theater, and how it was the only time in my life I've ever seriously thought about leaving a movie theater because I thought I was gonna throw up on the seats. I was so scared and uncomfortable. Hereditary is a 2018 horror movie from visionary Ari Aster, who also gave us the psychological horror movie masterpiece Midsommar, so Aster really just bangs out the hits. Hereditary is about as peak A24 horror movie as it gets. One of those ones where the monster is really a metaphor for generational trauma and all that. After the grand matriarch of a Midwestern family passes away, her daughter and grandkids begin to uncover the cryptic and terrifying truth behind their ancestry, trying desperately to escape the sinister legacy they've inadvertently inherited. This movie is terrifying in the worst of ways. It's not just jump scares or tons of blood. No. This is elevated horror. This is not your usual horror story. It really zeroes in on the way too close to home horror of watching a family break apart. It is gut-wrenchingly painful to watch, preying on really specific kind of fears. It's gonna get its hooks in you and have your teeth grinding for the full 2 hours runtime and for ages afterwards. If you've seen this, I dare you to look at a pigeon, a stop sign, cheese wire, or a treehouse ever the same after this movie. And staggering performances. Toni Collette goes for absolute gold and delivers one of the best performances I've ever seen in a horror movie, full stop. She needs an Oscar for most upsetting crying I have ever heard in a film, which is a category she would have no competition in. Hereditary might not be the goriest film or even the scariest movie I've ever seen or most upsetting. There's a bunch of Takashi Miike or Park Chan-wook films that would probably take that. But Hereditary is definitely one of the most viscerally scary movies I've ever seen. The kind that just sits in your gut and makes you think about it all day, like you were living through an actual nightmare. Watch only if you're truly brave. I know I made it sound absolutely horrible, but it is a great movie. Just don't be surprised if you don't sleep that night.